Hi, everyone. I'm Fatima Goss Graves, President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, and welcome to our first virtual gala and our pre-event with all of you. I'm so excited to be in community with you guys tonight and really excited to be in conversation with two legends in the law and thinkers and believers in this moment. We're here with Dahlia Lithwick from Slate Magazine and also Professor Melissa Murray from NYU Law School. So without further ado, we will get this going and I will let Dahlia take it away.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and to you all for joining us virtually. It is such an honor to be with you tonight and to be moderating this conversation. Fatima, you already know, Melissa Murray is the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU School of Law, and also on the board of directors of NWLC. So it is a joy to be here with you. I always say that in these tough times we've had, the sweet spot for me is just women, lawyers, Venn diagram right there. That's where I feel like I can breathe. So welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that both of you agreed to join us in this conversation.
So Melissa, I too like to think of myself as an optimist, and I think
you're not an optimist, Dahlia.
Pardon me?
You're not an optimist.
We just said I'm Tigger but broken. I am broken Tigger, but I aspire to be an optimist. And one of my very favorite optimists that I suspect you both want to talk about a little bit was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because my God, if anyone just defiantly saw the glass half full, it was she. And I think that when we trace some of the great unraveling of the last few weeks and months, it really was this magical belief that she was going to, despite all the cancer and despite all the frailty, outlive everybody. And that someday, in 2057, we could reckon with her passing. And of course, that didn't happen. So Melissa, I just want to start with this simple question of, we've all of us talked, I think, probably ad nauseum about what she meant to each of us and to so many of the women who are here today, who probably have like the candle and the tote bag and the teacup. But I wonder if you can lash together her optimism, the belief that this was to some purpose and that the arc of the moral universe is going to get us to the right place. And some of the things that Fatima is saying about what we have seen, despite institutions that were a little more rickety than we thought. Can you marry that worldview to what we have really just gone through and some of the trauma and the violence for particularly women, communities of color, particularly immigrants, particularly LGBTQ Americans who don't feel very optimistic right at this moment?
Well, I will try. Let me first say that one of the things that always impressed me about Justice Ginsburg was that she very much understood her story to be a quintessentially American story. She was a second generation American on, I think, her father's side or her mother's side, and a first generation American on her father's side. And her story, she said, could not have happened anywhere else. The idea that you could go from a mother who was a bookkeeper to a daughter who was a justice of the highest court in the land in just one generation was almost unfathomable anywhere else in the world. And so, I think part of her optimism was the kind of optimism we associate with the American experiment. And, I'm not one for American exceptionalism. I think there are lots of countries that do things exceptionally well, but I think that there is a kind of hopefulness about America that she certainly embodied. And the idea that we are continually striving to be better than we were, to be better than we are in any particular moment. And that was certainly something I took away from her jurisprudence and her life. I mean, she was an amazing example. And, there's been a lot of discussion, I think, in the weeks since she passed about, whether her jurisprudence or her advocacy was specific, or a particular kind of feminism that wasn't as inclusive perhaps as it could have been. And, I think I would like to set the record straight. Like, yes, she was a woman who definitely championed causes and ideas that very much benefited a certain group of women, maybe women who are more privileged than we might imagine. But to say that women of color and Black women in particular were not included in that vision, I think is really to get the vision really, really wrong.
I wonder if we can talk about another thing that I felt was entirely missing from the hearing, and that is, and I think, Fatima, this can be a question for you, but maybe Melissa, you have thoughts on it. We are not just talking about abortion anymore when we're talking about women. And this got framed, I think, even if we were just going to be talking about abortion and June Medical and the future of Roe and Casey, we could have had an interesting conversation. We didn't even have that conversation. We had, I think, an entirely fatuous hide the ball conversation about, is she going to overrule Roe, which is not the point. But I also think we have slid into a world, and you mentioned contraception, where contraception is on the table, where IVF is on the table, where a whole bunch of ways of arranging and organizing our lives, our reproductive lives, we're seeing people confirm to the courts who are opposed to things that I suspect a lot of women, even in this room, don't know are on the chopping block. And so I wondered if you can talk a little bit about, I don't think it's a failure of the movement. I think it's a failure of imagination. I think we just don't realize that contraception, as you said, is on the chopping block, particularly, I think, with this 6-3 configuration of the court. And I think we're looking down the barrel of a whole bunch of things that start a lot earlier than the alleged late-term abortions that we are myopically focused on.
Yeah, I think that you are right, that there was a period of time where it was hard to imagine that we would be in a space debating whether or not contraception could be criminalized, or whether or not personal decision-making full stop would be on the table. What are the limits? And I think the thing about the hearing that many of us were left with was mostly the things that she wouldn't say, right? The many, many things that were totally off the table because they were highly controversial issues that might come before the court. So if it is the case that personal decision-making, your ability to make decisions about who you're having relationships with, your ability to determine when or whether you have children, that all of that is too controversial to have actually a meaningful conversation at a hearing, then it sends a signal to the many state legislators about the range of things they should and could be bringing to the court. And so, when I think about access to abortion care and the signals that have been sent over the last couple of years that led to the sort of battle royale between the states over who could pass the most radical law to most directly overturn Roe, the aim is not just to end abortion in a particular part of the country. The aim is really to dramatically control how you make decisions about your life, your future, full stop. And so if there is one failure, it is probably, as you say, not recognizing the pace in which that was coming and the full aim, right? The extent of it. And so I actually think our movement is pretty clear now about what is in front of us and the dramatic work ahead, the work that is in and out of the courts, right? The work that is cultural work and institution work, and really making more of a reality the fact that In this country, you have a giant political problem if you are in a situation where the vast majority of people in the country and in every state support access to reproductive health care, but the decisions that are made politically are the opposite. And so grappling with that is of a first order.
And Melissa, I think I want to ask you a version of the same question, which is simply, what do we do about the fact that I'm sure an awful lot of people who are joining us today are thinking about this in terms of, okay, this is bad. We have a 6-3 court. We have a whole bunch of abortion cases teed up. And as Fatima says, we have cases, places that want to just nullify Roe and are pushing it up to the court high speed. And that at the same time, while that feels existential in some sense, I guess you're right, I'm not an optimist. That feels existential, but in some sense, that's the tip of the iceberg. The sentence, Roe v. Wade is overturned, or, undue burden is whatever it is, that's half the battle here. The real battle, and the thing I think we as women have really failed to grapple with or catch up with, is that we're talking about surrogacy and IVF and contraception. And we're talking about, Texas holding hearings about capital punishment for women who terminate pregnancies. Like, the world has changed, even from the world we thought we knew 5 years ago.
So I will take this to an even darker place. We've all talked about this question of what happens if Roe versus Wade is overturned. We've talked about it ad nauseum for the last 4 years. For many of the women throughout this country, that moment has already happened. They live in places where reproductive freedom is so sharply cabined that Roe is essentially a nullity for them. And that is especially true for women of color, women who have fewer economic resources. And the truth of the matter is, if Roe is overturned, there will be ways for women with means and resources to figure their situations out. They will leave the country. They will find doctors who are willing to provide the procedure to them safely and effectively because they have the resources to do it. That's not the case for the broad swath of women who don't operate with that level of privilege. And it's important to remember that. When we talk about Roe, we are already talking about a conversation that for some people is a reality, right? A world without Roe. And it's not just abortion. And this was sort of the beauty of Justice Ginsburg's jurisprudence. She understood that the conversation about reproductive freedom was more than just abortion. The case that she wanted to see get to the court to decide the question of reproductive freedom was a case called Struck versus Secretary of Defense, in which the Air Force required an unmarried pregnant captain to either terminate her pregnancy or lose her position in the Air Force. So we have the government requiring and subsidizing abortion in order to make this woman either stay with her job or find a way to get out of it. And she thought that was the better case because it teed up this question about reproductive freedom, not necessarily being about avoiding pregnancy, but rather about actually being able to make decisions about your life. This captain in question, Captain Struck, was an ardent Catholic and did not want to terminate her pregnancy, wanted to see the pregnancy through, give the child up for adoption, and then return to service. And the military wouldn't let her do that. In the end, the case was mooted. The military changed the policy, and Roe versus Wade was the case that went up before the court. But she thought that was a really limited framing of the issue, the question of avoiding pregnancy. She thought it was about so much more than that. And we see that even today.
It brings me to this question for you, Fatima, which is, we have what we have. We have the 6-3 court. And if we want to go one darker, because it's a party, but if we want to go one darker, worth saying, I think, that the federal appeals courts and the district courts are also altered probably for a generation in ways that now I think unlikely to be remediated unless something happens in Georgia in the coming days and weeks. So how do we do this bold visionary organizing around all the things you've talked about, all the things Melissa's talked about, when you're in fact sort of wrong-footed now, right? Because you're trying to bat back what feels like catastrophic outcomes at the same time that I think we're all of us recognizing that the work to be done is just deep and broad and really visionary and proactive. And I know this is what, you think about all day and all night. So maybe help us reimagine how we're going to do this, given the reality that we now live in.
Sometimes a thing like a pandemic brings to the forefront the things that have long been broken. And, care is an example of that. It is totally the case that even before March, when all of a sudden we all were apparently part-time teachers and working full-time and caring and all of the things, even before then, our care system was extraordinarily fragile, right? It was hanging on a thread. It was built off of paying largely Black and brown women poverty wages with the hope that that would sustain us all. And so we actually have an opportunity to reimagine it. And I think there's some lessons from this most recent election that sort of hopefully will point people in a direction. What you saw is that when issues were put directly to voters, they did really, really well, right? When paid family and medical leave went directly to voters in Colorado, they supported it in ways that were actually larger than any of the candidates. The same was true for universal pre-K in Colorado and in Oregon, for raising $15 minimum wage in Florida. Again, got more votes than the candidates. And when the effort to ban abortion again and again and again hit Colorado one more time, they beat that back. Now, that's not to say that there were wins everywhere, but it should, we were left with a symbolic and harmful vote in Louisiana that was, yet again saying we're coming for you to make it harder to access care. But at the same time, it should be a reminder to politicians, but also to people who are yearning for something more, that the country is with us on these issues and on these questions. And the work of changing our culture to match it, the work of pushing our institutions and our laws and policies, that is not easy work. It's not like direct line work where you win every single time. But this election was a reminder that people are already there. And so we are going to be in the trenches in a serious, serious way over these next few years. We are going to see a third of the Court of Appeals has now been appointed by Trump. We will see what that looks like, and it will continue to pay off. But I still continue to put more of my hope in the ability of people in this country to name a different future and put the sort of pressure on our policymakers that makes a difference.
And Melissa, just in that vein, you've talked about the need to turn the court itself, Article 3 courts, into kitchen table issues that people understand. This is not an abstraction, right? If you care about the environment, if you care about workers' rights, if you care about women's rights, the court is your ticket. And that somehow that connection seems to have eluded progressives for a long time. Not people here, but some progressives, a failure to say, if one has lost the courts for a generation, these other outcomes, Joe Biden can sign a lot of executive orders. It doesn't help. And so I wonder if there's something so beautiful about what Fatima just said about it's a kitchen table issue when you're in a pandemic and people realize minimum wage is existential. And I wonder if there's a way to connect up what we've seen sort of on the ground in terms of organizing and just the larger discourse around the courts and the composition of the courts that signal to you that maybe the courts are becoming the kind of urgent issue that progressives, particularly women who kind of show up on the steps of the court when there's an abortion case, but not always entirely tuned in, present company excluded, but not always tuned in other than sort of episodically. Is there something, are we working our way toward a more organic global way of thinking about women and justice in the courts?
Well, I think one thing that would help our framing and centering the courts in our understanding of a lot of these issues is just centering women in our understanding of a lot of these issues. I mean, Fatima spoke about all that the pandemic has revealed. I think all of that is exactly right. But I think what it's revealed most of all is that our entire market-based economy is completely upheld by the work that women do. Like, you can't go to work if you have children if someone's not taking care of them. And for many of us, the most important form of state subsidy that we get for caregiving is the provision of school. And when school evaporated or went online and suddenly you were a teaching assistant and a terrible Zoom school in your basement, you saw how important the work that teachers do is. And 70% of teachers are women. And we have talked about how underpaid teachers are, how underpaid daycare workers are. That is the infrastructure that makes a market economy go. We cannot talk about opening up without talking about schools. And yet, all summer long, we talked about opening up bars and gyms and all of these other places. And no one thought to talk about schools because the assumption is that there's some woman who's going to figure it out, she's going to do it all and she's going to figure it out. And I think that actually has to stop. And Fatima's right. They are kitchen tables issues and we need to connect them up with the court. Just a few days after the election, the Supreme Court took up the question of the continued viability of the Affordable Care Act. You could understand that case as a healthcare case. You could understand it as a question about congressional power versus individual liberty. Or you could understand that case as one that very much implicates questions of gender justice. Like, imagine how different this pandemic would have looked if individuals were not covered by the ACA. It's already pretty bad, but it would have been impossibly worse if we hadn't had the ACA and the protections for healthcare that existed there.
And Fatima, I think that's doubly challenging in a world in which, Melissa just talked about the Affordable Care Act. When that question was put to Amy Coney Barrett many, many, many times, by the way, during her hearing, we just got lost in the morass of severability doctrine, right? And everybody went on screen save and nobody knew what she was talking about. And I think it's worth tracking what Melissa just said with the fact that some of the really terrifying prospective changes in the law are going to happen under the guise of non-delegation doctrine and Chevron deference and the kind of stuff that even a third-year law student would go on screen save. But I think that nobody is going to posit any of this as we want to take stuff away from women. We want to hurt vulnerable minorities. We want to make sure that women are in no way able to control their economic, reproductive, family lives. It's not going to be done that way. And so what do you do when you're trying to get to, I think Melissa's triangulating us there, a world in which everyone understands that the court doesn't pop up for a week at the end of June with decisions, that the day-to-day work of Article 3 courts, and as Melissa says, state courts, is this stuff. And yet it's all obscured behind a lot of lofty language about, deferring to agency interpretations of their own rules. How do we do that?
Some of it is storytelling, but some of it, to take us back to Justice Ginsburg, is actually naming with clarity what's actually happening. I think about the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act being the first bill signed into 2009. The reason that was possible was because of the way in which Justice Ginsburg told that story. Right? She told the story of Lilly Ledbetter and what she endured for decades in terms of pay discrimination. And she also explained what that court's ruling meant in reality, right? She said, in reality, if we go with that approach, that means that you would have to know that you should be challenging your pay discrimination the first thing you do on the job, because you only have 6 months. And if you don't do it in the first 6 months, you can never challenge it again. That was shocking to people. That was stunning to people. But if we had gone into some legalese that didn't center Lilly Ledbetter's story working at a Goodyear tire and rubber plant in Alabama, I don't know that you would have had the uprising. And I'll say the passage of the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act led to an uprising, not just around fixing the very precise destruction of Title VII, but it was more, right? It led to more than 20 states looking at their fair pay laws and understanding that actually we need to do better. It led to a deeper examination of the race and gender pay gaps and the many ways that we need to solve them. And some of it is addressing pay discrimination for people in the same job, but some of it is doing things like ending the motherhood penalty or raising the minimum wage. And so I think we have to go back to the people who are at the center of these issues time and time again.
And Melissa, just for you, in terms of, I suspect a lot of folks who are listening in right now feel like the courts are lost for a very long time, and that court reform, structural court reform in the way we might have been pushing for some version of it, is also possibly lost for a long time. And yet, justice is not lost for a long time, and this work is not lost for a long time. What's the thing that gives you hope and optimism in a time when it does feel like the superstructure that Fatima just described is pretty relentlessly arrayed against the kinds of equality you think about every day? What's the path through?
One of the things I think that has given me sort of strength and optimism in the last couple of months is the idea that there were so many people who are unwilling to take this. Like, this is the status quo is not what I want it to be, and I'm going to do something about it. Who could have imagined 6 months ago that there would be such record turnout in an election? I mean, 6 months ago, we thought we would all be in our homes and maybe there wouldn't be an election at all, or at least not one with meaningful participation. But people came out for all of the reasons that we've talked about. Like, they were exercised, they were energized, and they wanted to make their voices heard. And to me, that is the lesson. And, we have a situation now where I think the courts are being weaponized for minority rule. And when I say that, people, like, what is she talking about? It's very simple. Things that could not have happened through majoritarian political processes are now being deployed through the courts. Like, the Republicans could not dismantle the Affordable Care Act legislatively. John McCain voted to uphold it. And so instead, what we see is this challenge going forth in the courts, using this minority institution, the court system itself, in order to create a system of minority rule. And then you have the people responding through the political process to say, not on my watch, I'm not going to do that. And, we're obviously in a situation now where there are lots of questions about what will happen going forward, but it is incredibly encouraging to see all of the people who responded to this moment and wanted to make their voices heard. I am incredibly encouraged by the work that women like Fatima and Stacey Abrams have done around the country to rally people around particular issues and to get the vote out. That's amazing. That's something that we can think about. I'm really encouraged by the work that one of my Berkeley Law students, Lala Wu, has done with Sister District Project. They recognize that a lot of the stuff that we care about is not happening at the federal level. It's actually happening at the state level. And if you want more progressive policies, turn state houses blue. And they've really been working on that. And I think that's amazing. If you care about voting rights, redistricting, you got to care about not just the federal level, but also what's happening underneath at the state. So I think there are a lot of places where we can continue to fight. And the courts may not be in our favor right now, may not be in our favor for a generation, but there are still places where we can continue to push the envelope and to bring the fight to them.
The little flame of Tigger has now been lit. Fatima, I want to give you the last word. Just noting with gratitude what Melissa just said, how hard, oh my God, how hard you've worked. But can you talk a little bit about what gives you hope in a time where, boy, it looks as though institutions and systems are not necessarily at your back? What gives you hope?
Well, I'm gonna end maybe where I began, and that my hope is with the people in this country who declared that they wanted something different. And my hope is with the organizers around the country that sort of put it all on the line again and again. And my hope is also with the staff and board and friends of the National Women's Law Center who really showed up. When I think about these last 4 years, when we were hit back again and again, they kept showing up and sort of bringing all of their creativity and energy to bear. And in these last 2 months, when they found out that Justice Ginsburg had passed away, they did not sit this out. And they showed up because we are constantly dreaming for a different future. And so we're taking the long view, even as we're fighting some of these short-term fights. We're taking the very long view of achieving a world where gender justice is a reality.
I want to thank, oh my God, this was nice. Right into the veins, y'all. I want to thank both of you. You have been tireless heroes. And I hope someday all of our respective daughters really do, with the mugs and the, they do understand that it's women lawyers have been superheroes, truly, truly, time and again. And I congratulate you. I'm delighted to be here. And I thank you so much for not giving up.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for the work that I know is required ahead.